Good afternoon. Does this work as well? Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Welcome back. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to the chairman, to the Commissioner Peirce, and to the SEC Crypto Task Force staff. Welcome back. We are going to go for our next round. This will be more discussion. And what I'll do is I'll first introduce everyone and then give some sort of framing comments to segue into our discussion with questions. I'll give our panelists some questions and we'll have a discussion and we'll open it up to you as well. We'd love to have some to hear from you all. But as I said before the break, we have assembled some very bright minds. Little brief background on everyone before we get started. Starting at the end, Catherine Kirkpatrick Boss, General Counsel at Starkware, former Chief Legal Officer of Centralized Exchange DCM and DCO, and General Counsel of a DeFi protocol called Maple Finance. She spent years as a partner in private practice government investigations at King & Spalding, and she joined Starkware to learn about the best or from the best minds in zero-knowledge proof tech. And that technology, along with other innovation, she feels is a key to protecting individual data privacy. Next to her, Carol House. Carol House is CEO of Penumbra Strategies. She's also a distinguished senior fellow for ACAMS, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and Carol previously served as the lead for cryptocurrency and identity policy at FinCEN, the U.S. anti-money laundering regulator, as I'm sure most of you know. And she did 3 tours at the White House, including at the National Security Council, where she helped to architect the first ever executive order on digital assets. Next to Carol is Linda Zhang. Linda is CEO of Digital Self Labs and a visiting scholar on financial technology at Georgetown's University Law Center. After working on the regulatory response to the global financial crisis, Linda became one of the first U.S. regulators to join a crypto startup and has since worked on DeFi payments, data privacy, and decentralized identity. And then we have also, next to her, Summer Mersinger. Summer is CEO of the Blockchain Association, and she previously served as a commissioner for the CFTC. With over 20 years of experience in public policy and government affairs, Summer has held senior roles at the CFTC on Capitol Hill, and where she was as chief of staff to Senator John Thune. And she, of course, has been in the private sector. We also have Jay Stanley. He's a senior policy analyst with the ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project, where he's been researching, writing, and speaking about emerging tech at the ACLU for over 20 years. And our last couple, rounding up, J.W. Verrett, tenured professor of corporate securities and banking law and forensic accounting at George Mason Law School, Antonin Scalia Law School, and he's a practicing forensic accountant and licensed cryptocurrency forensic investigator. I should also mention he's a former member of the SEC's Investor Advisory Committee. And then our last but not least, closest to me, Steve Elderman, formerly at Coinbase, also Department of Justice, and he was a tenured professor at Notre Dame Law School, and he left academia because he wanted to help make crypto's promise of an upgraded financial system a reality. He's now general counsel at Etherealize, working with Wall Street institutions to create Ethereum-based market solutions. So, quite a group here, right? A lot of experience. And before we get into it, I want to say a few words. And I actually want to start from something that I heard Jill say earlier. And I want to zoom out because I can't compete with our speakers who are going to dive into the legal policy, the economic implications of this technology. But I'm going to zoom out on something that we don't talk about enough in government, culture. And Jill, you said at the beginning of the first round, you said privacy is a moral imperative. I think those are the words that you use. And I wanted to segue into this discussion with the idea that goodness in a society is a function of privacy. So I'm going to really, really zoom out because people are going to talk about the constitutional implications, human rights implications. I'm going to zoom out to culture, to the civilizational health, some might say, of a culture, of a society. If you look up privacy, or at least the etymology of privacy, you'll understand it comes from the Latin privatus. Privacy, the root, it really means to set apart, to separate. And I was reflecting on this term, this idea of what privacy really is, when I recently saw two movies. And they're both semi-old. One is very old, you probably never heard of. The first movie is A Quest for Fire. And A Quest for Fire is a 1981 movie set in, it's fictional, it's not accurate, but it's supposed to be set in like the Neanderthal period, and these cavemen are looking for fire. And something really piqued my interest is that these were hunter-gatherers, and this is accurate, that in those early days of hunter-gathering society, there wasn't much privacy. The people slept together. It was, even intimate acts often were not private. And because in this sort of hunter-gathering sort of primitive state of being with the group, being with the crowd was your security. You couldn't venture far off and alone. And this later changed in the movie. It shows that when later they figure out how to create fire, they get more cultured and figure out language. They interact with people who have language, and then you see in the movie, it's really interesting how it ends. Is that some of the characters, they go off and they need to become private. They meet with people who build houses, who have culture. So there's something about how when a society gets more complicated, culturally, not even just technically, but just socially, psychologically, privacy becomes a desired factor. And I think what we have talked about, some of what we've talked about today, is this challenge around privacy leads to tensions. In our society, the roots of goodness, it goes back to scriptural traditions, we would say. And if you think about how privacy comes even in those scriptural traditions, I think it tells us something about where our society is headed. Look at the Abrahamic tradition. Look at Moses. It was in privacy that he went to the burning bush. It was in privacy at Mount Sinai that the Ten Commandments were revealed. The Torah talks about Moses going away, right, for 40 days and 40 nights. If you think about in the New Testament, Jesus often going away from his followers, going away from the crowd to commune and to meditate and to pray and to go away from his followers. So privacy key to the gospel. In the Abrahamic tradition of Muhammad also found guidance by going away to a cave and inspiration coming when he was seeking separation away from the crowds. Because in that going back to the early days, it was the crowd, you needed the crowd. But what our culture perhaps has evolved to was separating from others has led to this idea of how you find goodness. So I want to end with this before we get into a discussion. In our digital world, sometimes it seems like we're heading towards digital Neanderthal life. Everything is broadcast. Everything is observed. Solitude is exclusive. And I think maybe this tension we have that around privacy is maybe right now humanity is trying to recapture that privacy that civilization saw that it needed to develop and to build culture and civilization, trying to be separate from the observing crowd. The second movie that I saw recently was Apocalypto. And that movie, if you remember about the Mayans and their decline, it made me think, what is human sacrifice but when the autonomy of the individual is consumed by the dictates of the crowd, of the authority? Human sacrifice could be seen as the lack of privacy, autonomy. You're doing something, and in the movie, they felt that it was more secure for the nation to sacrifice the individual. So I'll try to land the plane. I know I went off there. Where are we? I think where we are now here at the SEC with this conversation is we're dealing with the struggle. We're dealing with the fact that our lives are observed. It's essential that our data, everything is out there. We're trying to figure out how to be in solitude again, how we can live away from the crowds. And so for our discussion, I'll end here that there's the economic, there's the policy, there's the cultural. All of that is intertwined. And as I said at the beginning of our talk, we're trying to ensure that we can shape the technology so technology doesn't shape us to the detriment. So I'll start it off with our discussion first going to something that was said. Maybe I'll sit down. I don't want to stand up here at the podium, but I'll come and sit down. I want to start with Steve. We'll start off the discussion here. Steve, you told us in our introduction here that you left a tenured position at a top law school because you wanted to help make the crypto promise of an upgraded financial system a reality. So how does everything we've learned about privacy relate to that objective of yours? And I really kind of want to hear about that motivation. So let's take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the SEC for organizing this today. Thank you very much. Thank you to the SEC for organizing this today. I did leave a tenured position in academia to come work in crypto, and specifically to come to Etherealize, because I believe we have a generational opportunity to upgrade our financial system and bring markets into the 21st century. And so that's in a general sense why I'm here today, but it's also in a very specific sense why we're here today. We have the technology to do this. We have the upgrade and the unlock to make markets more efficient and to bring them into the 21st century. But the missing piece is privacy. Privacy is not an optional feature when you're trying to upgrade the financial system. It's really table stakes to bring financial institutions and broad retail adoption on chain. And it's the great unsolved problem in crypto. Not unsolved, as we saw, in a technical sense. We have the technical solutions. But I think what we're lacking so far is a social and regulatory consensus about the degree of privacy that we are going to allow users of the technology to have, while still maintaining ties to the traditional financial sector. So I guess I would just elaborate that and say, when I think of privacy, I don't think of it as merely the right to be left alone or the right to be left in your basement, but the right to participate in a public forum without giving up all of your private information, without fully revealing everything about it. It's really a right and ability to selectively disclose the details that you want to selectively disclose. And right now, I think a lot of crypto users, a lot of people that would like to use blockchain, are sort of forced into a channel where they sort of have to go to a fully private mode or to a fully public mode, and making crypto markets work like other markets where this right to selectively disclose is really well recognized requires introducing that nuance and leveraging these technological tools so that you can share the information you need to share with counterparties or regulators who might need that, while also withholding information like your full book or other transactions you've done, keeping those in reserve without fully disclosing them.
Thank you. And I like that you started out by explaining that there's a need, the tech is here, and there's a need for a framework. And what I'd like to do actually through this discussion is for us to get towards baby steps. What are the practical baby steps? And I think you've sort of started us out in order to address this tension between privacy and security. What are the things that need to happen? And I'll turn to JW Verrett. I've heard you argue that there is a perimeter beyond, and I think I'm quoting you, but maybe I'm paraphrasing, that there's a perimeter beyond which governmental financial surveillance has no constitutional grounding, which you say is non-custodial DeFi. What, according to you, is within this perimeter, and explain precisely what lies outside that perimeter?
Sure. So historically at the SEC has looked to the guidance of Treasury Department in implementation of AML KYC obligations for regulated parties. This is pretty easy to do when assets trade in an environment that's fully regulated. Everyone it touches is regulated, the exchanges, the brokers, the dealers. What happens when tokenized equity lives in DeFi, which is something I hope we'll see next year? I would argue I have a hard time finding the SEC's jurisdiction for AML KYC regulation of tokenized equity living in that environment. I don't see it in the federal securities laws. They all reference the intermediary party, the broker-dealer. And as a pragmatic matter, even if you could change it, I'm here to urge the SEC to reconsider looking to the guidance and leadership of FinCEN and OFAC. I mean, the fact is, in the last few years, Treasury's record in defending expansion of AML KYC is not great. It's about 0-4. Corporate Transparency Act, 0-3 across multiple jurisdictions. Big loss in its aggressive designation of tornado cash. So 0-4. This is a record that a New York Giants fan can actually talk trash to, right? So I don't think it's a good idea for the SEC to look to the guidance of the Treasury Department in considering what KYC AML obligations to attach to tokenized equity living in DeFi. It's not a good idea. I also don't see the statutory basis for it. And if you want to talk bigger discussion about the founders and about constitutional law, I would recommend reading Justice Thomas's concurrence in a case called McIntyre, where he reviews the history of the founders' understanding of privacy as anonymity. Boy, they were privacy maxis and anonymity maxis like me, partly because their favorite hobby was lighting each other up in the press and anonymously, and efforts to de-anonymize them were fought back, successfully fought back. So yeah, I would define that perimeter as tokenized equity trading in true DeFi.
Okay. Thank you. And we're talking, I mean, you're bringing out the question of how should regulators respond, what additional regulation is needed or isn't needed, how it should be deployed. I want to turn to Summer. You've been a regulator, right, in a previous life, and now you're leading industry efforts to engage on policy, and so you've seen both sides. And you said something that I thought I'd like to hear you elaborate more. You said history has shown that more government has never been the answer, or that's a quote that you said. Relate that to the issue of financial surveillance and financial privacy.
That's a tough question. No, I think the idea is that government itself tends to look at government for a solution. And the solutions aren't within the walls of these agencies, within the walls of Congress and administration. The solutions are all out there in the private sector. And so what needs to happen is, conversations like this, where you're talking to folks in the industry and you're learning about what technology is out there and what solutions are out there. And I think we have a responsibility to bring that to the regulators, to bring that information to the policymakers so that they know, okay, here are the things that can be done where you don't need full government surveillance, or you could, the digital identity is a great example of that, where, here you can choose what information you want to give. I think if you're, inside government, you're just thinking to yourself, I just need all this information. I really don't care how that impacts the person. I'm just going to ask for it, and they're going to have to give it to me. And I think, my opinion, that was always a wrong way to look at it. And really looking to the private sector, looking outside of government walls, was the way to figure out how to solve some of these regulatory problems and issues that come up with the modernization of finance.
That's excellent, and I think that's what we're doing, right? Assembling all of these voices, many of us with government experience. Catherine, I want to turn to you over on the end. You've said, this is a quote, I think, that privacy technology is economically essential. I'm wondering if you could unpack that for us.
Yeah, so there's a lot of really important parts of this conversation, and one is, privacy is a fundamental right, is an expression of morals and values. And, one is privacy tech as a mechanism to enable Americans to control their data. Those are two really admirable concepts. But there's a third in that effectively privacy as an economic need as markets move on chain. And, as Chair Atkins mentioned at the very beginning, we're at this point where the market finally is ready to fully acknowledge the many advantages of crypto, whether it's atomic settlement or speed or cost savings or very sophisticated cryptography like ZK Starks, which are, quantum resistant. And what does that mean? Well, on a public blockchain, everyone can see everything, and there's multiple economically important use cases that make it very difficult to move public markets on chain and have that transparency, frankly. So, asset managers, global hedge funds, other market participants, They need privacy for competitive strategy and to advance free markets. Companies may want to explore paying global employees in stablecoins for cost savings, speed, efficiency. Well, they need a mechanism to prevent all of their employees from seeing compensation data. Entities need to proof of reserves without, revealing their entire balance sheet. I could go on and on and on for the economic use cases that are absolutely essential. We've seen so much progress when it comes to tokenization or tokenized equities. We need the accompanying privacy infrastructure to support that modernization. And, the other thing I'll say is, look, we've mentioned zero knowledge proof technology a couple times. No one has actually gone on to explain what it means. And the ZK tech was very exciting to me and was one of the real reasons I joined Starkware as kind of the OGs of ZK tech, both for the economic promise of ZK for privacy, but also protective, meaning a technology that can get us to the point where Americans don't have to offer up personally identifiable information for every and any transaction. And I always like to use a very basic example of what ZK tech means. And my favorite example is there's an attractive young woman. She's 21. She goes into a liquor store. She wants to buy a bottle of wine. The clerk is hitting on her. He's making her uncomfortable. Does she really want or need to give him her driver's license with her home address? I think that use case is really impactful because it shows you that, this kind of selective disclosure can be used in and out of cryptography, in and out of the public markets for a whole spectrum of very real world use cases, including, frankly, safety. And the one thing that I would like to take away from today that is my most important action item is historically, we've gotten to the point in the United States where there is an immediate negative correlation with privacy. Privacy bad guys, privacy wrongdoers. And of course, as we've discussed, there is a degree of truth in that. But as Chair Atkins and Commissioner Peirce both mentioned, Americans should be able to use these tools without coming under suspicion. But it is equally important for builders to be able to build these tools without coming under suspicion because, frankly, at this point in time, the market and Americans need these tools.
So Americans need these tools, but let's also zoom out to the rest of the world. And I want to turn now to Linda Jiang, because you've worked with U.S. regulators and their international counterparts. You've worked with coordinating bodies around the world. And you've mentioned that the U.S. is the only G20 country without national personal data rights. So I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more. Why is that the case and why we should care about that?
Thanks so much, Yaya, for highlighting this, and thank you to the SEC for inviting me to speak. I began my legal regulatory career, I'm dating myself, back in 2001 at the OCC, at the New York office. Second day of my job, I saw the planes hit the World Trade Center and the Twin Towers falling, and that led to Congress passing the USA Patriot Act within 2 months. And I found myself working on BSA AML enforcement actions based on this expanded authorities from the USA Patriot Act. But now you fast forward to 2025 and you see last year alone, US banks spent $5.9 billion on financial crime compliance, but intercepted less than 1% of illicit activities. So I argue that our current BSA AML regime is broken, but it's not only just broken, it also leads to a unbanked population of over 14%, underbanked population of over 14%, and around 4% of unbanked population, because it's simply too expensive to bank populations that are high risk because they're either poor or from single family homes, or if you're Black or Hispanic. And I'm raising this as, okay, we have some real issues with the regime itself, but there are also constitutional issues with the Bank Secrecy Act and the extensions that have been added, including the USA Patriot Act. So why are we the only country out of the G20 that does not have personal data rights? It's a really good question. We currently have what I call passive data protections for financial data under GLIBA and FCRA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act and the Fair Credit Reporting Act, where banks are required to send you annual notices about how they use your data. I'm just curious, does anyone read those notices? I mean, I personally. Oh, one person. You're a reporter, though, so. But most Americans don't realize that, okay, they get these notices on how their data is being used and shared with banks, by banks, but ultimately they don't actually have the ability to control their data. And we're supposed to be able to do that under open banking, but we actually don't have open banking rules in the U.S. CFPB did attempt to pass one, but you know what's happening to the CFPB now. Ultimately, what we really need is a baseline of personal data rights that allow us to not only control our data, and these are what I call active data rights, where it's not just passive notifications by financial intermediaries, but actually the right for us to decide what we want to disclose and with whom we want to disclose.
Interesting, and I'm sure we could get into the weeds maybe a little bit later about what model do we use. Are you suggesting we go the route of the EU? Do we learn what are the mistakes? You don't have to answer that now because I want to bring on Carol House. And Carol, I got a quote from you. I know you've mentioned privacy as infrastructure, which is something that Catherine referred to, and you said that privacy is infrastructure. It's a feature that you bolt. It's not a feature that you bolt on later, right? It's actual infrastructure, and that we have this sort of limited window to build digital systems where accountability and autonomy exist together, but we have to make these choices now. But you also said a point which is very important, especially in light of everything others have said. Too much security threatens liberty, but so does too little. Chaos, manipulation, and exploitation can destroy freedom just as effectively as surveillance. That's a quote that I have from you. I'm wondering if you could break that down and bring that into the conversation.
Absolutely. And again, thank you so much to the SEC team for convening this really poignant discussion, especially in the wake of the current look at AML that's currently happening holistically across many regulators and institutions, even with a lot of questions very pointed, especially towards assessing the cost, and I'm concerned maybe not enough same measure focused on assessing the benefit, but I do think that a meaningful deep dive discussion of privacy actually brings that to bear and to the forefront. And I love this, talking about privacy, we and even I will say the balance between privacy and security, but I do think that that's a bit of a misnomer at times. There are tensions, there are naturally that exist between elements of security and privacy, but there's also connective tissue, and as a cybersecurity nerd, we know the three components of cybersecurity are CIA: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality is an element of privacy. There's a lot of mutual reinforcing that goes between security and privacy together. So it's an interesting mix of these two things and interconnections together, but there's a lot of, and even a lot of the other civil liberties that are being brought up in discussions around choice, control, consent. These things are not the same as privacy. There's a huge overlap, though, massive Venn diagrams between these. There's elements of consent that exist inside of privacy frameworks, but also elements of privacy that can end up not necessarily involving consent. And that's where thinking about a privacy framework, and I'll point to the NIST privacy framework because I love standards, because I'm a good DC cybersecurity nerd, thinking about what the different elements are of a privacy framework on identify, control, govern, protect, respond, recover. None of that points to that privacy must be attained via unbreakable anonymity. Now, unbreakable anonymity is a means of achieving a type of privacy, but then the discussion really has to be about what is the privacy that we want. And this gets into what Linda was speaking about, that I feel that there has not been enough of nuance in many of the discussions that paint privacy as a binary and instead must be a really nuanced dissection of what information should be discoverable by whom, under what conditions, permissions, and protections, and via what process, what technology, what governance mechanisms help to achieve that. And AML is often painted as the bad guy. I do think it gets a bad rap sometimes in this. Rightfully, in some ways, there's a lot of real challenges that we have on efficacy with AML and on really addressing it in a full-throated, meaningful way. But also, there's a huge amount of overlap that exists with a lot of these protections, and even in places on things like regulation for peer-to-peer transactions. And I mean just cash. We have regulations that apply to cash peer-to-peer transactions. Sanctions and taxes are examples of them. So interesting when thinking about how does that apply in a digital version of that. And then even with some arguments that at least I feel on like the nature of different kinds of intermediaries that exist across the spectrum of DeFi, across not just custodial intermediaries, but others as well. So I do think that thinking about what we want the future of accountability, security, privacy to look like in the future of a digital economy where we know that the discoverability is important for things like taxes, everyone's favorite regulatory framework, but also for achieving credit. Like, how do you want to achieve credit in a world of unbreakable anonymity and people can't understand you and your risk profile and relationships? What does civil litigation look like for fraud and recourse for people that are harmed? What do contentious divorces look like? These are really, really tough questions and issues, and I do think that technology, and I'm very excited because since 2018 at FinCEN, we were telling industry that we felt that privacy was the future of this tech. We did not think that public unobscured ledgers was going to be the future of finance and that digital identity was going to be the future. So the regulators actually saw this coming. We just recognized that when you take away currently the one risk mitigant that's deployed at scale across most crypto, which is the public unobscured nature of the ledger, since programmability hasn't been leveraged enough as a risk mitigating feature, then you just have the risks of wire transfers and cash coexisting in the same asset. So that's why I love that so many of the solutions that were showcased were talking about programmability and trying to leverage this so that as we get privacy, we need to figure out what the other risk mitigants are. But I just wanted to give that kind of holistic overview on the national security side, that there's a lot of interplay, but it demands a lot of nuance that not all discussions have showcased.
And it's good to have a holistic view, and I think we're doing that. I think each of you has shown that we're looking at this as, I think many of us are seeing privacy as a part of everything, right? There's not just one, oh, that's privacy, and it's a static thing. You have it. It's what is the policy? What is the policy objective? And then how do we maintain and preserve privacy based on our laws? I want to round up our opening discussion. I want to come to you, Jay Stanley. You've been researching, writing, and speaking on emerging tech at the ACLU for over 20 years. And I heard you say once that we've got all this crypto magic. We should use it. What did you mean?
Yeah, what I meant there was cryptography, and I mean the technologies that we've been talking about in terms of zero-knowledge proofs and the like, and that I think that there is a lag between what is available in that technology. Some of that technology is 20, 30 years old, and some of it is brand new. Some of it is old but hasn't been figured out how to be implemented and so forth. But there are increasing opportunities for us to have our cake and eat it too, in terms of being able to preserve our privacy while achieving other goals. And so, for example, in the digital identity realm, we are gravely concerned by the digital identity systems, the digital driver's license systems that are being passed in the states, which are not being done with sufficient protections for civil liberties, especially the protections against the fact that we're going to wake up one day, and because it's so easy to share your ID, that every website you go to is going to demand that you click here to share a digital driver's license. The fact that you can go to a bar and that you can just prove that you're over 21 without proving your age or your birth date. But what if the bar is like, no, I want everything on your driver's license. Oh, so your friends are in there? You want to join them? Sorry, you're going to have to do it all. There's real world power that that digital identity will fall into could actually worsen people's privacy, because it's so easy to. Sites are not going to ask you to do a 3D video and hold up your thing unless they really need to, because it's a big ask. But if it's just click here, they're going to ask. And so it could actually be a detriment to privacy. And more broadly, I mean, It could be used in payments as well, these technologies. They could be used in other areas. These technologies that have emerged from cryptocurrency could be used in areas like cell phone tracking. Why does Verizon track everywhere I go? It's a side effect of how the cellular network works, that they need to know what cell towers I'm near. But there was a group of people who created a cell service that uses zero-knowledge proofs to blind the provider to the location and to the data that I'm flowing. Verizon could implement, if two guys could implement that, Verizon and AT&T and the others could implement that, but they don't want to. But more broadly, in terms of payments, financial privacy is a mess right now. Jeffrey Fowler, who works for the Washington Post, went and bought a banana at Target and tried to trace exactly where that data went, and he found at least 6 parties that got a record of that purchase that he made. Target's payment of service, a point of service provider, the credit card, Visa, MasterCard network itself, the co-branded partner, anyway, all this stuff. And there basically is no way to engage in private transactions that don't have intermediaries, with the possible exception of cryptocurrency. And we need to fix our privacy, our financial privacy system. For us, our perspective is that privacy as a civil liberties issue, privacy is something that adheres in individuals. It does not adhere in companies or large organizations. If you're a company, you may want secrecy, and there may be reasons to provide, say, a funds manager who needs to prove they have assets without revealing what the assets are, or to avoid revealing your trading strategies. But those are not privacy issues. Those are secrecy issues. And I have no expertise in what the right balance is in those kind of financial transactions, and the ACLU doesn't have that expertise in terms of like what's the right thing to make people reveal or not reveal.
Right.
When it comes to privacy, is something that adheres in individuals and really means saving people from being dominated by others by having their lives turned upside down.
So I wonder if we can open it up. You all have set the stage, and a lot of things have been mentioned. I want to maybe double click on the issue of, because you said, Jay, we need a better sort of financial privacy system or something along those lines. The BSA has been mentioned, the Bank Secrecy Act, right? Our AML CFT framework. There was a quote I remember someone said. They said the BSA is the worst AML system around the world except for all the rest. Sort of tongue-in-cheek comment. You get the point that maybe the person was trying to make. So I want to open up with this question. If we're talking about the Bank Secrecy Act, what are you all thinking? Is it that a new system is needed? Is it that it needs to be reformed? Is it that it just needs to be applied to this new technology? What's the range of thoughts on that issue? Anyone have any burning thoughts like, that's the wrong answer or that's the right answer? Feel free to jump in, Catherine. You hit the dial first, so you go.
I feel like I'm on Jeopardy, I'll jump in to say one of the things that no one has mentioned today is agentic activity, AI agents, how AI is going to transform this conversation. And look, I think there is a shared acknowledgement that parts of, I'm formerly chief legal officer of a centralized exchange. So obviously we were a money service business. We had quite an onerous and very hardworking compliance team working on manual anti-money laundering, KYC, all of the related issues. And I don't think anyone is saying throw that out the window for centralized entities. Absolutely not. But the problem is, when you ask someone to send you a photocopy of their driver's license, we've reached a point of absurdity in that I could create a driver's license in a matter of seconds online using AI that's indistinguishable to the human eye. So obviously, this manual process of AML KYC doesn't make sense anymore. So there just has to be a better way. I think that a lot of people have suggested that we scrap the Bank Secrecy Act entirely, but the problem that I think we all can acknowledge is that the technology is also moving so fast that it's hard to start from scratch in a way and design a mechanism that isn't going to be antiquated in 5-10 years. So what I would like to see is more education regarding a lot of the technology that we've discussed today, and a formalized mechanism to accept usage of that technology, which is superior in its, I should say, sophistication, arguable in efficacy, because we haven't seen the data, but to have that be a reasonable alternative to what exists today. And some of the things that's preventing an embrace, whether it's entities or individual users from exploring, this as another option, is frankly a lack of regulation and a lack of acceptable standards.
Well, because I would ask, and I think maybe some people in the audience may say, okay, we just saw the digital ID presentation, we just saw all of these solutions, and you just show that this stuff does not work. Any 2-bit criminal can falsify an ID. Why is it that banks aren't using digital ID? Why aren't they even complementing their systems through this sort of technology? Let's get to that. Who wants to step in? Linda and then Jay.
Well, just real quickly, I don't see why mobile driver's licenses being issued by state DMVs couldn't count as documentary evidence under the Customer Information Program rules of the Bank Secrecy Act. Why not? Why can't banks accept that? So actually, I'm throwing the question back at everybody here. This is where we should be able to start creating room under the current rules to allow for institutions to use these technologies.
Jay and then Carol jump in.
The banks and the financial industry are actually one of the prime movers that are pushing for digital ID. So they want it. It'll save them a lot of money and so forth. On the BSA, our view is that the problem with the current KYC AML regime is that it is moving too far down into the weeds of ordinary people and ordinary transactions and becoming surveillance of people's lives. We do recognize that the government, when you start to talk about larger and larger amounts, the government does have a legitimate interest in monitoring large transactions, business transactions and the like, but it shouldn't engage in surveillance over ordinary people.
Carol.
Great. I know I mentioned needing nuance, and that I think that this has been a challenge that's plagued people that have wanted to try to re-envision AML, but have really faced a hard time actively doing it. Part of the challenge is, as an example here, for things like digital identity, FinCEN said in 2004 that digital certificates can be used in the conduct of KYC. There's a lot of things that are not a policy problem. There are some things that are a policy problem, but really getting into the weeds of what is the policy issue? What is the implementation issue across institutions whose counsel, whose risk appetite, whose whatever. Again, I know I mentioned AML often gets a bad rap in some cases, and I think in some cases it's fair, and in other cases it's blamed for things that are actually other risk appetite and credit checks and other issues, and it demands nuance. And in other cases it's an enforcement issue. And so then, is this a problem of the regulatory policy shop, or is this a problem of examiners and needing to update examination manuals? The solutions are different in each of those cases.
So and before you jump in though, Carol, if you're saying the policy is fine, it's for over 20 years it's been clear that people could use this, then still what's the blocker? Yeah,
and I think, and again, there's lots of different policies that make up the Bank Secrecy Act, and I think that there's probably a huge spectrum of views of specific policies. But in the case of KYC is also a really it is a colloquial term that refers to a basket of a lot of different obligations. For covered institutions, things like CIP and the customer identification programs, CIP does not apply to MSBs or money services businesses. So it's a mix of risk-based, first onboarding, verifying reasonably that identity is real and belongs to that human that's asserting it, and then more broadly monitoring the risk, profile of this person, and can include things like enhanced due diligence and suspicious activity monitoring, et cetera. So even that term, demands a nuanced understanding of like which elements it is that demand looking into. So I would say that for things like digital identity, there's a lot of issues that have inhibited its broader adoption. Industry hasn't coalesced around choosing which service providers that they want to adopt. There's politically radioactive issues that come with certain elements of digital identity. A lot of things get into, it depends on the implementation and industry coalescing around common standards and best practices. It just hasn't happened yet at scale.
Okay.
But I think there's room for movement.
Okay. JW, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, the presenters on the first panel are building some incredible products that are going to find great market fit in helping to make the AML compliance easier for central institutions, intermediaries that are required to comply. They'll find great fit with protocol builders who want to use them voluntarily for their own purposes. I fear the outer limits of what they could be used for. Can they lead to the sort of tyranny of the smart contract? You could find product market fit right now to try to help implement capital controls for countries around the world and stop crypto use as a way around these just human rights violations, I would say, in capital controls. You're an Argentinian and you lose 70% of your wages over a year in hyperinflationary environments, and you find stablecoins and Bitcoin as your last line of defense. Will the providers be willing to use digital ID to help implement capital controls? Or you could get to a lot of hypotheticals about purchase of guns, about abortion rights. Will they be willing to be service providers, see their programmable tools used for those purposes? We just coming out of Operation Choke Point 2.0, a very serious, I think, violation of rights, violation of economic rights, and it will be overwhelmingly tempting for a political party, left or right, to use programmable compliance, to use ZKIDs. I'm going to go on the record right now and say I predict there will be a Choke Point 3.0 eventually. And the tools used by the purveyors of that will be digital ID and programmable compliance, unfortunately. And that's what worries me. That's what worries me.
Steve.
Hopefully at some point they'll invent another name. They don't have to just keep calling it Choke Point. But I think I agree with everything that's been said about privacy as a civil liberty. I think also, since we're at the SEC, we should be talking about the economic case for privacy as well. I think the SEC recognizes this isn't baked into so many rules, both under FINRA and under other SROs, is that privacy and confidentiality are critical to capital formation and efficient markets. This is not like merely a civil liberties issue, but it's also really core to the agency's mission, and that's why I'm so glad that the SEC is organizing this conversation today. And if you think about the lack of privacy, forcing people into a binary choice of hiding or going into full public view, there's really a deadweight loss associated with that. You can think about all the activities that people might not go out and do that would otherwise be socially valuable, economically valuable to them, but because of the disclosure they would have to do to go partake in something, not doing it. And I think that there's a really timely example of this right now when we have the opportunity to upgrade our markets by bringing things on chain. There's a lot that we can do under current rules and regulation, preserving existing market structure, current financial surveillance rules. A lot of that can be ported over. We can unlock huge value today, but then there's a lot more we could be doing to expanding access to markets, to getting trading happen 24/7, and to improving the financial system in ways that will require revisiting some of the assumptions that we've made about data visibility in different parts in the market and different market actors. And so I think there's a significant opportunity, but sometimes the human mind undervalues opportunity. We're more motivated by loss. So I think we should be thinking about what economic losses are we suffering by not having these conversations, by not providing regulatory clarity, and by not moving markets forward.
I wonder if I could throw out a provocative question, because I'm going to check an assumption. We're here, we're all on board, the importance of privacy, high priority importance. The question often comes up, or the issue often comes up as, as much as like when Linda said, nobody reads the terms of agreement, et cetera. There's also a situation where some would say people are okay with giving up their privacy, right? Don't we hear that? As much as people are saying, much as all of us are saying, I stood up there with the whole thing about civilization needs privacy, right? So, but is privacy in the way that we're talking about it desired? I think it is, but how do we address this response that people often bring up? Catherine.
Again, I win Jeopardy every time. Look, you're absolutely right. Yeah. It is undeniable that many people, maybe even 9 times out of 10, if you gave them a choice between privacy or ease of UX, they would probably choose the latter. I mean, look at this panel. I think we all could admit that we have an app on our phones that we're fully aware is monitoring us, and we went ahead and maybe not JW, but everyone else, you know. We know this app is monitoring us. We still want it. We deal with it. We swallow it. We move on. So that's why I think at this point, as much as I think that the conversation about the privacy as a fundamental right is more important, what might be more timely is the discussion of privacy, or whatever you want to call it, lack of secrecy, lack of transparency, if it's not privacy as the term of art, what we need to do to accommodate for the facilitation of a free market as assets move on chain. And that is not necessarily a retail user question. That is an institutional macro market question. But the time to discuss that is now, because I used to say you go to any type of crypto conference where there's an institutional audience, everyone is obsessed with talking about 3 things: stablecoins, payments, and tokenization. Well, as of late, that conversation has shifted to privacy, because we've now made enough progress on all 3 of those things, which necessitate some form of privacy or some form of negative implication if all of that is visible on chain. And there's also obviously pros and cons of that kind of transparency vis-a-vis, for example, market manipulation and the ability to front-run transactions. So it's also timely to consider what needs to be done to protect a retail user that might not have the speed of an institution if everything's transparent on chain. But this is a more important conversation to be had right now, or a more timely conversation to be had from the institutional perspective versus the user perspective. And the user perspective should be there as a specter.
Steve, and then Jay.
Well, I completely agree. I mean, this is sort of something that frustrates privacy scholars who believe their work is super important, and then they encounter a retail person who will trade their DNA for a gift card or a chance of winning a gift card. Financial institutions, however, know the value of their data and know the value of their information and are very careful about what they leak and how. And so to achieve this, this real market upgrade that's going to require onboarding financial institutions, we can't just hide the ball like we might with retail users. I will say, though, that I think that as builders in this space, and when it comes to retail users, because ordinary people tend to undervalue their privacy, privacy should be turned on by default, and that I think that in the Web 2.0 and like the Facebook and Gen 1 social media, there was a profit motive to deprive people of their privacy. And that sort of created perverse incentives to hide settings or to make it confusing. There's a whole book of FTC enforcement actions, rooted in this very phenomenon. And what seems perverse is in crypto, there's not the profit motive to deprive users of privacy. It's not the same kind of like game of your privacy is our profits, but there's the threat of enforcement, and that like regulatory uncertainty and fear of what might happen to the developer of a tool is what's potentially making us build things in a way that's less privacy protected than it could be. And so I think that as technologists, a lot of us want to do better than we saw companies do in the early 2000s. But that ironically, it's potentially the failure of clear rules that might be pushing us in a less privacy protecting direction than private industry would be building for.
Just a bit of a note, we are going to open it up to questions. So if you're thinking of a question you want to ask the audience, we'll continue this discussion, but feel free to come up to the mics if you have a question. We'll get to that soon. But Jay and then Linda.
I was just going to say, polls show that a lot of people are very concerned with their privacy, for example, online, but they feel as though they have no control over it, and so they live with that anxiety. And look, there's a lot of issues out there, from the environment to everything else, and it's a complex world, and people only have so much time to worry about so many things. But the government's own statistics show that a significant proportion of the unbanked are so because they are concerned about privacy. And I think that even if people don't understand it, they will suffer effects if their privacy is invaded. For example, we're seeing a big discussion now on surveillance pricing, which is really where the rubber hits the road, where your data is directly used against you, against your own interests, by being manipulated through differential pricing. And so it's incumbent upon policymakers to protect people from that kind of manipulation and to help people protect their privacy. And I think the last point to make is just that I think that the arc of history is long, but it does bend towards privacy. Over time, people, eventually it sinks in, whether it's because of the pricing that they're getting is different from their neighbors or what have you. But like the telegraph companies were reading everybody's telegraphs in the 19th century for a couple decades after the telegram was apparently some of the telegraph companies were trading on Wall Street based on inside information they got and everything. But a couple decades later, we put in privacy controls. It just took a while. And so I think that we will see a similar catch up in this world.
So here, I think we as a panel seem to agree that privacy is a fundamental right, and that's a given. But the truth is, I don't really see it incorporated in financial regulation, not only today, but as soon as the Bank Secrecy Act was passed. So it was passed, over half a century ago, way before the internet, and it was challenged immediately, went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, oh, no, it's okay. It's not too bad. $10,000 reporting threshold, that's reasonably high. That's not going to violate anyone's privacy. Well, guess what? Half a century later, it's still $10,000. And if you throw that into the St. Louis Fed calculator for inflation adjustment, that would be equivalent of around $82,000 today. And I saw the BPI comment letter. They actually calculated it at up to $150,000. That figure was never adjusted, and it's still the reporting requirement today for currency transaction reports. So whenever I send, and I'm outing myself here, but for family financial management, I send probably around 10 grand once a month to my husband to pay the mortgage, right? And so I'm sure my bank is filing his CTR. So my question here is, what is really our social value? If it's really privacy, then we should not be thinking of this as a utilitarian approach. It should really be about individual rights. And this is just a really hard adjustment, I think, for regulators and policymakers to make, because it is a hard balance between national security and individual rights. And it raises lots of questions like the runaway trolley scenario, right, where you have like 4 people on a trolley that goes out of control, and as you save the 4 people on the trolley or you kill the one person who was not involved. Well, most Americans are not money launderers, but all our data is hoovered up. And so I am raising this as a question of, do we want to actually draw a clear line that we need to have, the individual rights will trump national security? And that's a very hard question, I think, for policymakers to answer.
Carol.
Yeah, again, I really appreciate this issue because it demands so much nuance. And I'll first just say that an observation that I do have also, again, defending AML, is that a huge amount of financial surveillance that occurs is not because of AML. It's because of monetization and data brokers and a bunch of other things that have nothing to do with AML. There is a lot of information that is collected around AML. A lot of it's collected by institutions and then held and waiting for process, and then others is just reported proactively to the government pursuant to the regulations. So it's a mix of things. But I will highlight that even just that, the fact that there's some record-keeping obligations that then are made available upon request, upon subpoena, that is a version of privacy. That may not be the balance of where people want that privacy to exist, but that is privacy not being anonymity. Privacy typically means that there is sensitive data that exists somewhere that can be discovered under those permissions, protections, and conditions. So then thinking about when do we want that to be able to be discoverable, including if the answer is never, or if the answer is all the time on a public unobscured ledger. But like, I think we all agree that it's, somewhere in the middle or on the extreme end of like, no one wants everything to be discoverable all the time on this panel. panel. But I'll highlight that I will mourn the issue that Linda brought up about the fact that there is no consumer privacy legislation in this country. We have privacy frameworks, but they're application specific and very fragmented. We have HIPAA, we have right to financial privacy and Gramm-Leach-Bliley, but like they're very fragmented. We have state level stuff. Like it's just not holistic. But me highlighting the fact that there's a two-tier regulatory approach, like the fact that all this information isn't coming in on a conveyor belt into the government. And by the way, I have seen, this was many years ago, but there were some crypto companies that were hoping to offload compliance and were asking FinCEN if they could just give us all of their information and then not have to pay for compliance. Now, that was a long time ago, and like lots of maturity has happened in the crypto sector since then, because I didn't feel that represented where their privacy stances were anyway, and that was like one or two companies that I just, like, again, I don't think that was reflecting where they wanted to be, but also will highlight that based on this application-specific privacy approach, money is different than information, and I feel that it should be. Not everyone feels that way, including, I think, on this panel. But basically, part of why as a cybersecurity person, I demand more privacy in my information transactions. And I like using encrypted messaging apps, and that is a personal position that I take. I demand more of that in my information activity, and I understand that as a society in a higher risk activity like financial activity, that there's more discoverability, and that's not just to prevent North Korea from funding half of their proliferation activities with crypto heists and cybercrime and IT workers and massive prevailing frauds that now reach the scale of a G20 economy. Like that is we achieve a greater balance in my information activity because there's more discoverability in financial activity. I feel that that's part of the connective tissue. But again, I know that that's just my view on how that balance should look. But anyway, I'll stop.
Yeah, and we're going to go, JW, I'm going to go to you. I want to signal as we sort of get towards the end of, not the end, but almost the end of our conversation. I want us, again, what are the baby steps? And actually, I want to give you all kudos. The audience probably doesn't know this. None of these, they didn't know any questions in advance. This whole conversation, like even the intro questions, they didn't know. So all of this is live. But JW, let me give you an opportunity to respond, and I'm going to ask another question.
Yeah, well, I would take the opposite view that Carol does on the question of the role of money and the money versus information. I would say the perspective in Citizens United looks at money as speech. And the Supreme Court also looks at as anonymity as a right to speech. So it's all connected. But look, overall, you wanted something tangible. I would say, I hope when the SEC does next year, let's hope some tokenized equity exemptive relief. The SEC recognizes that privacy is an investor protection question. Rent attacks are real and they're nasty. They look at base layer neutrality as consistent with the mission of fair and orderly markets and the competition and capital formation objectives of the SEC. And I would hope they think very carefully about attaching KYC AML requirements to tokenized equity that lives in DeFi. I hope they do allow tokenized equity to live in DeFi. Be careful about what you attach, because KYC AML lives on top of the third-party doctrine, and that's hanging on by a string, because I think Justice Gorsuch would revisit that today if he could. And maybe, I guess I should want the SEC to do that, because then that could be the test case that kills the third-party doctrine. But no, seriously, I would not attach too much to it, because it will imperil tokenized equity exemptive relief, because you don't have a statutory or constitutional foundation to force compliance with that regime for tokenized equity living in DeFi. That's my 2 cents.
Jay, did you want to say something?
And just a quick thing on this point. I guess our view is that we probably agree, actually, that money is not totally equivalent to speech, and that, like, we think that if you want to send $500 million around the world, it's probably in the government's interest to monitor that. But like, if you want to send a really, really long piece of speech, it's still equally protected to short speech. But the two issues are very combined, financial privacy and speech, because when you have intermediaries that are spying on you, whether they're private sector or not, that also gives them the power to censor you. And we have seen this in many ways in which the credit card companies, for example, have censored and blocked sexually oriented transactions, such as including like the sales of a book and the like. And so privacy and free expression and accessibility are all tightly aligned, which is why I work for a project at the ACLU called the Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project.
I want to get towards, and again, audience, if you have questions, please come up to the mic. Practical steps, right? It's a great opportunity here because we're here in the house of a regulator, and this means that they're looking for insight into things that they can do with technology changing and how they should approach their policy moving forward, and regulation moving forward. Before we go to audience questions, Jay, you said, we got to use this cryptography magic while we have it. I want to pose this question. What should regulators be doing in terms of staffing up or getting educated on specific expertise to deal with cryptography, encryption, blockchain technology in a way that they hadn't? What would you advise the agencies and offices to start doing? Anyone have something there? And, Catherine.
Surprise, surprise.
500 on
Always.
Jeopardy.
This is a very easy baby step, is allow regulators to engage with the technology fully.
Okay.
So there's still an impediment. As far as I know, regulators are still unable to buy and trade cryptocurrency, which is really terrible, frankly, because most of the people, one of the many reasons I love crypto is there's very few people that learn about the technology and engage with the technology and then say, oh, this is a terrible idea, I'm just not interested in this. Usually it's the opposite. They get more and more intrigued. And there's a certain vernacular that you need to understand as a kind of starting point to be able to fully engage and understand the technology. And it's very difficult for someone to do that when they're just watching someone demonstrate. It's a lot easier to learn this technology and the many possibilities of the technology for good without that engagement. So baby step, theoretically easily achievable. Let all regulators and legislators be able to fully engage.
Very, very tangible. Any other quick ones before we go to the audience? Okay, Linda.
We don't have active personal data rights in our legal framework federally, but that doesn't mean regulators can't start baking that into what is acceptable. And so I think that should be a very important fundamental principle. And then the other, that they also encourage open and permissionless systems. If you combine the two, the ability to control our data, that will allow for us to have customizable, programmable compliance and privacy. And you plug that into open permissionless systems, that also unlocks for innovation. So these are, I think, two principles that regulators should keep in mind.
JW, before we go to the audience.
What I want for Christmas is SEC no action relief or exemptive action that cites to the cypherpunks and cites to May and Hughes and Szabo and Gabe Shapiro and Vitalik Buterin and the philosophical underpinnings of crypto. That's what I'd like to see.
All right, is Santa listening? All right, we'll go to the audience. Please say who, give us your affiliation and your question. Over here. Oh. Turn on the button there. There you go. Can you all hear? Maybe you turned it off.
Better?
Yeah, there you go.
All right, we're good. Thanks, Shaya. Kyle Blige, Head of Policy and Public Affairs at the Decentralization Research Center. Thank you, everybody, for your comments. Prior to this panel, I was spending some time with my colleagues in the Senate discussing market structure. Lively conversation going on right now between both sides of the aisle of where to apply KYC and AML requirements, if any, to this new burgeoning technology. So to the panel, for members of Congress and their staff trying to figure out the perfect balance of personal liberty and the state's responsibility to engage in national security actions for purposes of protecting certain acts of economic activity, what should senators be holding in the balance as they consider whether or not any existing BSA or KYC regime should apply to DeFi or blockchain applications broadly?
Well, I know we already have some thoughts. I don't know if people want to give a concise response just for the staffers listening to this. Because this is a big question that's happening right now. Carol?
It's definitely a big question. I will start by just saying that I will take more actual implementation of the already existing requirements all day. Unfortunately, there's some dismantling of the enforcement apparatus and application that I'm worried is not going to be prioritizing that, but hopefully, I'm going to dare to be optimistic. If we get real implementation at the application layer, which is where most of the obligations exist right now, I think that you mitigate most of the AML risk and create some operational space for the broader risks presented by DeFi. If you need to go more broadly because we don't get compliance at scale across the industry, you either go to user, network, or protocol. I don't see anywhere else to go. You got to choose between one of those three. To me, network looks the most attractive. Others feel the answer is user. It can be protocol and administrator. A lot of different views and debate to have on that front, but I feel that those are the different layers that you have to go to depending on the risk. So anyway, because some of those serve as different kinds of intermediaries, even if not custodial.
All right. Just maybe real quick, Linda, and then we'll go over here.
So this is to add to the Christmas wish list. Can we please have a travel rule that does not create more honeypots? We have the crypto magic now of being able to send verifiable digital credentials and ZK proofs. Why don't we leverage that so we can avoid creating more honeypots? And as someone who's been a victim of the Yahoo breach, the Experian breach, the OPM breach, and latest, Change Healthcare, let's use some of this crypto magic.
All right. Let's go to a question over here on this side of the room.
Hello. Yeah, I'm just a developer, and I was curious, no one has talked about protections for developers. I believe code is free speech. Bernstein versus the United States, Daley versus Younger established this on encryption in the 90s. However, even in the first administration, Virgil Griffith, a working member of the ETH Foundation, was charged under the Espionage Act, just speaking in North Korea, a public talk. During last administration, Roman Strom has been persecuted. Is there any protections for developers? Because if so, there's no incentive for any of this innovation to keep going, and it will continue to be offshored. And I believe it is a fundamental risk that, yes, we may be able to operate in this current administration, but there is no safety guarantees moving forward afterwards. And what is being done for that?
JW and Catherine.
Yeah, I support the sentiment. Last year at this time, this week before Christmas, I spent every day in prison with a defendant who mostly was charged because he used a privacy tool in U.S. versus Sterling Off. And it was heartbreaking to go home to Christmas and just know that he was there. And he's looking at 12 years at this point. I am hopeful that we see some sort of something more concrete from this administration than the Blanche memo. It's a good start, but it is not much when we're still looking at Romans going to prison. I mean, that's what we're looking at probably, and we're looking at Keone Rodriguez, who's a very principled cypherpunk-oriented guy, is going to prison for 5 years. I think that's an injustice, and I'm hopeful the administration still has a chance to remedy it at this point with a pardon.
Very briefly, I was just going to raise, obviously, that's an impediment to the passage of Clarity because a lot of people want to see developer protections enshrined in Clarity. A lot of crypto wants to see that. There is or was a culture of fear amongst developers, and obviously one of the things that we love to see from regulators now is a real attempt by the SEC and other regulators to say, we want to see innovation thrive onshore. How do we do that? So these conversations are productive, and I think raising it is important because having that dialogue and understanding what are the impediments and what are the blockers to seeing America be truly number one, class A in innovation, in all forms of emerging technology. One of them is that culture of fear.
Let's go here on this side.
Hi. I'm Carol Van Cleef. I'm a lawyer and consultant. I've been in and around the crypto environment for many years, as well as well steeped in the anti-money laundering and sanctions regime. compliance regime. This has been a wonderful panel in terms of the diversity of views that have been expressed, but I have to say, I'm still hung up at the beginning of your presentation where you mentioned the 40 days in the wilderness for Moses and for Jesus, and trying to sort of reconcile that with the rest of the conversation. But I've heard many different themes here today, and what would be incredibly useful is maybe we can dump the audio of this into AI and come up with a list of the different kinds of issues and start to deal with them appropriately. I've heard comments like a differentiation between institutional sort of AML reviews and so on versus letting the little guy go. When we saw last week an enforcement action out of FinCEN that went right to child pornography and to the little guy, let the individuals, do what they want to. So I think there are a lot of divergent views that are here, and I'd love to have them sorted out. I mean, my head's spinning, and I've been dealing with these issues for many years from this conversation today. So that would be my request for today. I don't think I have a specific question, but would love to see you follow up in that regard. Thank you.
Should I do the job of the LLM and synthesize?
I can answer that one part
Okay.
of the question, though. All of these roundtables are put on our Crypto Task Force website where you can stream them later. Many third-party services provide transcripts of them, and we often do as well. So I do recommend pushing them into AI. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff covered. Sorry.
Can I just expand a little bit on the prior answer, the question about developer protections and developer, fear of persecution? I think, of course, we should have that, but I think it's almost too modest of an ask. I think that people developing software engaging in free speech should not fear persecution for putting out code, but that I think also as a user of a privacy-protecting protocol, you shouldn't have a fear of prosecution, obviously, but of having your funds frozen or having your account locked for reasons that aren't disclosed to you. And so I think this kind of gets back to privacy being for normal people and not being itself a suspicious activity. And I just imagine, Venmo used to have a thing where you could switch privacy on or off when you were sending it. It was defaulted to public, which I thought was crazy, back to our prior conversation. But just imagine if you flipped on privacy in a Venmo transaction and then that immediately froze your Venmo account. Well, that was suspicious. Why did you do that? And so I think that we should be thinking about not just protecting developers, but protecting users and on-ramps and off-ramps with clear guidance and allow people to rely on this privacy-protecting technology without that in itself making them appear suspicious or subject to persecution.
There are a couple more questions we want to get to. Go ahead.
My name is Kelvin Toh, Data Boiler Technologies. First of all, thank you for the panelists, and particularly glad to see Commissioner Summer and FCFTC. And my question is, cryptos, okay, one of the regulatory challenge is its global nature, okay? And how to regulate crypto globally. And BIS and Institute of International Finance has this project Agora, okay? And 40 global financial institutions already participated in the projects. And should U.S. kind of look into supporting that, or should U.S. come up with something different from what the global counterparts doing, right? Think about it, because regulating crypto is a really global thing, right? And the other thing is, look at this project Agora. Given this is similar to the consolidated audit trail of the U.S. SEC projects, right? And the consolidated audit trail projects is hugely controversial, okay, because, there's all this personal identifiable information being collected, okay? And this personal identifiable information, even though the CAT LLC, FINRA CAT LLC, recommend, okay, now they're going to remove it, but change the name to customer reference data. It's just another name for it, and when all the deleted records is kind of you can almost recreate the whole entire database of everyone's individual's identifiable information. What is that about? So the question is, okay, the panelists, how do we in the U.S. should kind of like look into supporting global, or should we kind of lead the world, come up with something different?
Yeah, and this really gets to the question. There is a social question. What is the cultural what direction does the U.S. take to address these issues, and how is this conversation happening globally? I'll let panelists, JW, if you want to step in.
Yeah, I think that's an argument for respecting base layer neutrality. I think that it protects against the possibility of multiple countries with competing expectations. Mm-hmm. And I think we should lead the world in respecting that. I also, you had referenced international harmonization bodies. They make me very nervous, especially in an environment when Chevron deference is no longer available to regulators. It's not enough to say, oh, we agreed to it FATF, now we have to adopt it at home. That's not going to cut it in the current era of administrative law. It's not going to cut it at all. And I'm not really interested in working with a global group that still uses the phrase unhosted wallet, which is a pejorative term that tells me you're not crypto native. So yeah, I would just focus on base layer neutrality, and I would ensconce that concept within the SEC's rulemaking in the first no action letter or exempted for relief it does on, or the next no action on tokenization.
Summer.
Can I just it's related to that question, but one of the baby steps that I think government could take and should take is look at the data we're collecting and figure out if we really need it. That was something that came up a lot when I was at the commission. They were always asking for more data feeds. And there were times I'd ask, does anyone else here in this building collect this data? And they couldn't answer the question. And so I think one of the things that government needs to do to kind of a step they can take towards, recognizing privacy is just look at the data you're collecting and maybe have some restraint there. Because the government collects way too much information, and it's too much personal information, and it makes just a honeypot of data for foreign actors and others to go after.
Carol.
Great. I'll at least highlight that I think that more experimentation, R&D, I think is really good in digital payments. I don't know if blockchain-based payments are the future, but I want R&D and experimentation, and I want the market to duke that out, including in other kinds of wholesale digital payments experimentation as well, that I'm looking forward to and seeing, and I think that they need to explore that, and that intimates a need for international partnerships and cooperation. We've not made the US dollar digitally available like around the world instantaneously to institutions in this meaningful way. Like there's a lot of work in crypto on that. I want it to be a catalyst in other kinds of experimentation too, and let's see what wins out. On the privacy issue, I'll just state as an answer to the meaningful, like near-term thing. What I really want, industry would come in and say, we want a sandbox. Like, great, we have that. It's called acceptive relief. What do you want? Write in for it. Ask us for the admin ruling. We'll give it to you. And we, at least when I was there, did not get the kinds of requests at scale on what those experiments should be. But FinCEN could also publish, here's a template. This is what I want you guys to write in to ask for a sandbox thing. Like, here's the project. Here's the mitigations putting in place that it's going to mitigate this risk and the obligation that I want relief from. Here's the KPIs that I'm going to use to monitor that risk and show you that my solution is going to solve your problems as a regulator better than your solutions did. Here's the amount of time that I want, and here's the on-ramp into overall approval or whatever it is that they want. I think the SEC and others could do that too. That could be published tomorrow. I think that's an opportunity for privacy-preserving tech and other implementations and architectures that haven't really been presented, even for ZKP, multi-party computation, homomorphic encryption, digital identity, all of that as a holistic framework. I think this could be done really, really quickly.
And if I could add to that, it's also, I think, important. I've seen this in conversations with regulators. It's really important that it's the covered institutions that are making these requests. A lot of times it's those folks who are working on the privacy solutions or the tech, and it's like they're concerned about what FinCEN does, but FinCEN wants to hear from the regulated institutions that it covers. So there's an opportunity for partnering, for really making sure if you're a technology solution that you're aligned with a financial institution, an MSB, that is covered by FinCEN when you make those requests and requests for meetings, all of that. We've got one more time for, okay, Jay, and then we've got our last question right here.
Well, I was just going to agree with Carol, and I think that there is a danger of obsessing too much on blockchain. I mean, our point of view is we need privacy in the financial system, but there are many ways to get there. You can use zero knowledge proofs to have a centralized ledger in which the ledger keeper is blinded from the transactions, and that's privacy producing too. There was legislation in I think 2023 called the eCash Act that would require the government to invest in researching bearer instruments that go phone to phone. Without a blockchain, but just allowing basically like a cash-like thing, but it's electronic. And so there are a lot of potential directions, and we just want a private system, and if it emerges out of blockchain and out of the crypto industry, great. But I think that the government should be wide searching, and policymakers should be wide searching and figuring out how we can get to privacy.
All right, our last question from the audience.
Hi, my name is Yanda Poo. I'm the CEO and founder of the Genius Room. I am a delegate for Women of Color Blockchain and also a 2025 recipient for the Inspirational Web3 and AI. Catherine, you were speaking to me when we started talking about those AI and agentic AI. So currently I am in testnet and I am working on a stack with no code, by the way, and it's in testnet. But the real issue is when I'm building this agentic AI and I'm starting to look at DATs, and that creates a semi-fungible token. In addition to, I'm looking at creating a solution for tokenized assets, real-world assets. So what is it? No action request for Christmas. JW, you said it. That's my request, is to be able to build this out so that I ask questions when I'm building these things. Do I need to have a money transmittal license? And using the X402 protocol, by the way. So I really want when you talk about innovation, think about that as well. X402 protocol as well as agentic AI.
Go ahead, yeah.
One point on that, I think that's absolutely right. Look, this is happening not just on the federal level, on the state level. We want to see experimentation and innovation from tiny builders without the threat of regulation or enforcement. That experimentation is absolutely necessary for development, frankly. The other thing that I'll say is probably on my Christmas list is, in keeping with our holiday theme, is that there's a whole slew of tools that we haven't talked about in depth on this panel. We've alluded to them. Obviously, ZK proofs being the most magical, but things like token level extensions, permissioned access layers, on-chain attestations. I think we should also be able to talk about those things and talk about that technology without fear that regulators or legislators are going to mandate implementation of those tools in DeFi, for example. Because anyone who's engaged with DeFi knows that A, it's hard to define what DeFi is, and B, there's a spectrum of DeFi. Are we talking front ends? Are we talking, centralized projects LARPing as DeFi? And there's a real fear in the space that we can't talk about the existence of these tools, which are really fantastic and should be implemented, for example, in centralized projects, because legislators are going to say, oh, those tools exist. Boom, everybody put them in. And I would like to say we need to have that open discussion at this critical time without saying just because a tool exists, it should be mandated across crypto.
And I think that's what we've done here. We've had an open discussion. It's been no holds barred. A lot of the tools that you learned about earlier today, plus the expertise of those of us who've been working on these issues for a long time. I think this is really just a great move for the SEC to put this together. Thank you, Samira and Landon and Ileana and the whole rest of the team for bringing us together. Maybe a round of applause for our panelists, and thank you. I think that's it.
That I'll be quick because I'm the only person standing between you and the weekend, and then I realized it was Monday.
You're thinking of the October 17th one.
Yeah, that probably doesn't bode well for any reflective thoughts I'm about to share, but I'll go ahead anyways. Today's conversation highlighted that Americans' right to privacy has been pretty seriously eroded. I particularly appreciated the points around retail users not prioritizing their privacy because it really underscores the point. Consumers have to agree to terms of service to have a phone, to open a bank account, to use the internet. Each time we check the box and click agree, we realize that we are giving something away. So when there is no choice to use something that is elective, like a social media app or a streaming service or a rewards program, it might feel like when so much has already been taken from us, what is there left to give? And so we check the box and we hit agree. We feel helpless about having any privacy in a modern world. But what else I've heard today is that we can go from a privacy insecure environment, like with the telegram or the phone operator who listened in on every call, to a more private environment, like with encrypted emails and encrypted phone calls. The technology panel highlighted that technological innovation can help us to get to a more privacy-preserving financial system. So my holiday wish is that we get there, and I think that's the task ahead of us in Washington, and I'm excited to be a part of it. Thank you all for being here, and I hope you all have a safe and happy holiday season. Thank you.